I'm leaving you. He said it so casually, like he was discussing the weather. For someone else. He expected tears, maybe even a breakdown. Instead, I smiled. Because while he spent months plotting his escape, he never realized. I was watching, calculating, waiting. He thought he was walking away with everything. He had no idea he was about to lose it all. You should be happy for me, my husband said, casually sipping his coffee. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. It didn't come. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, completely at ease, as if he hadn't just told me he was leaving me for another woman. This is best for both of us, he added. We've grown apart, and I found someone who makes me feel alive again. Alive. As if the past 10 years of marriage had been a slow death for him. As if I hadn't poured everything into supporting him, his career, his ambitions, his needs, while setting mine aside. You're not saying anything, he said, raising an eyebrow. That's a good sign, right? I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, in my throat, in the hollow ache in my stomach. My mind ran through every sacrifice, every moment of trust. I had stood by him through job losses, through his father's death, through every setback he claimed had weighed on him. Who is she? My voice came out steady, controlled. He sighed, shaking his head like I was missing the point. Does it matter? It does to me. Fine. He smirked like this was a game, like he had already won. Her name is Tessa. She's younger. We met at the firm. It just happened. It just happened. Like a car accident. Like a missed flight. Like something out of his control. You deserve to be happy too, you know, he continued. Maybe this is what you need, a fresh start. I don't want to fight. Let's handle this like adults. I almost laughed. Like adults. As if I was the one who had betrayed my vows. As if he was doing me a favor by walking away. Oh, and I think it's fair if I keep the house, he added. It'll be easier for you to find a smaller place. My breath caught in my chest. He had already decided everything. The affair, the divorce, my living arrangements, and now he expected me to smile and accept it. I looked at him, really looked at him. The man I had married was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Someone careless, entitled, already imagining his new life without me in it. That was fine, because in that moment, I made a decision too. He thought I would walk away quietly. He had no idea what was coming. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg him to reconsider. Instead, I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. I could see he was expecting a reaction. Anger, sadness, maybe even an argument about fairness. But I wasn't going to give him that. Not yet. I understand, I said finally, my voice even. His eyes flickered with something, relief, maybe, or satisfaction. He thought he had won. I knew you'd take this well, he said, reaching for his phone. This is why I always said you were different from other women, mature, logical. I almost laughed. I wondered if that's what he told Tessa too, feeding her the same empty lines he used to throw at me when he wanted to smooth things over. But I wasn't going to ask. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of thinking I cared about her. How long have you been planning this? I asked, watching him carefully. He hesitated, then exhaled through his nose. A few months, maybe 6. I didn't want to hurt you. I was waiting for the right time. I nodded again, but inside, something sharpened. 6 months. That meant while I was cooking dinner, doing his laundry, listening to him complain about work, he had already decided to leave me. He had already made plans for his future, one that didn't include me. I want the divorce to be clean, he continued, like he was doing me a favor. No drawn-out court battles, no fighting over petty things. We can split things fairly. Fairly, I echoed, tilting my head. And keeping the house? That's fair? Well, I'm the one who pays most of the mortgage, he said, waving a hand. You can afford to get a nice apartment. Something cozy. Besides, it'll be easier for Tessa and me if... He stopped, realizing his mistake. He had just admitted he was moving her in. For a moment, I didn't speak. I just watched as his confidence faltered, his mask slipping ever so slightly. He hadn't planned for this part, for the quiet, unshaken way I was absorbing his words. I see, I said finally. And I did see. Everything. He thought he was in control. He thought I would pack my things, sign the papers, and disappear quietly. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the familiar rhythm of his breathing beside me. He had no idea I was still awake. No idea that I was staring at the ceiling, my mind working through every detail, every move he had made. 6 months. That's how long he had been planning to leave me. How long he had been lying to my face while he mapped out his escape. But he had made a mistake. He had assumed I would let him dictate how this ended. I rolled over slightly, watching him in the dim light. He looked peaceful, his face relaxed, completely unaware that his perfect little plan was already falling apart. By morning, I was ready. I moved through the house like nothing had changed, but inside I was cataloging everything. Our joint accounts, the mortgage details, the valuables he assumed I wouldn't fight for. I pulled up old emails, found receipts, and saved them to a private folder. I logged into our bank account and checked the withdrawals. He had already started moving money, likely preparing for his new life. I made a note of every transaction, every time he had transferred funds into his personal savings, every small, calculated theft. Then I called my lawyer. You said he's been planning this for months? She asked, voice sharp. And he's moving money already? Yes. Good. Then he's left a paper trail. I could hear the smile in her voice. By the time he got home that evening, I had already taken the first step toward dismantling his plans. I had locked him out of our joint account, moved my personal savings to a new bank, and scheduled a meeting with a forensic accountant. He walked in, loosening his tie, looking at me with that same cocky, self-satisfied expression. He still thought he was ahead of me. Long day? I asked, setting a glass of wine on the counter. Yeah, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. Tessa and I are looking at places this weekend. I need to get out of here soon. I took a slow sip of my drink. He had no idea. Take your time, I said smoothly. No rush. Because he had no clue that I had just turned this into a war, and I wasn't about to lose. The next morning, I watched him walk out the door like nothing had changed. He kissed my cheek, out of habit, not love, and grabbed his briefcase, already focused on whatever plans he had with her. I waited until his car pulled out of the driveway before picking up my phone. Everything's set, my lawyer said as soon as she answered. We've frozen all joint accounts for now. He won't be able to access them without your approval. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. He was about to find out just how unfair this divorce was going to be for him. I checked my emails. The forensic accountant had already flagged multiple transactions where he had been discreetly shifting money out of our accounts. Small amounts? Nothing major. Just enough that he thought I wouldn't notice. But now those little thefts had a spotlight on them. I smiled. He was going to regret underestimating me. By the afternoon, my phone buzzed. A message from him. Hey, weird thing. Our joint account isn't working. I was trying to send a transfer, but it's blocked. Did you change something? I stared at the screen, debating how to respond. Then, I typed back. Me. Oh? That's strange. Maybe call the bank. I wanted him to panic first, to go through the motions of realizing he had lost access to money he thought was still his. An hour later, another text. They said the account is frozen. What's going on? I ignored him. By the time he got home, he was annoyed, but trying to keep his frustration in check. He walked in, tossing his keys on the counter. We need to talk. I set down my book and looked up at him like I had no idea what he was talking about. About what? The bank, our money, the accounts are locked, and they won't tell me why. I tilted my head, pretending to think. Maybe because we're getting divorced? His jaw clenched. I told you I wanted to do this fairly. Fairly? I let out a soft laugh. Like how you fairly started moving money behind my back? Or fairly decided to keep the house? He shifted, running a hand through his hair, the first real sign of nervousness creeping in. It wasn't like that. I was just making sure I was prepared. So was I. He exhaled sharply. Look, I don't want this to get ugly. Oh, I know, I said, standing up and walking past him. You wanted this to be easy. For you. I didn't turn around as I left the room. I wanted to let the silence sit there, let him feel the weight of what was coming. Because this was only the first hit, and he wasn't ready for what came next. The first real sign of panic came 2 days later. He had been tense the night before, pacing the house, tapping at his phone, probably texting her, trying to figure out what to do next. He hadn't brought up the accounts again, which meant he was either buying time or plotting his next move. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee as he walked in, already dressed for work. He looked at me like he was debating something, then finally said, I talked to a lawyer. I didn't react. I just stirred my coffee and waited. She says the bank shouldn't have frozen the accounts without my consent. Did you lie to them? I didn't lie, I said calmly. I simply informed them that my soon-to-be ex-husband was shifting assets before a divorce. They agreed that was suspicious. His lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't used to losing control. Look, I get that you're mad. I'm not mad, I interrupted, setting my mug down. I'm just being smart. Like you. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something behind his eyes. Doubt. Maybe even fear. He was realizing this wasn't going to be a simple, clean break where he walked away unscathed. Let's be reasonable, he tried again. We don't have to fight like this. Oh, I agree, I said, which is why I also spoke to a lawyer and a forensic accountant. His face paled just slightly. I could almost hear the calculations in his head, running through every bad financial decision he had made, every text message he had sent, every dollar he had tried to tuck away unnoticed. A forensic accountant? His voice was tight. Yes. I let the word hang in the air. He swallowed. You're really going to make this ugly? No, I said, standing up. You already did that. I'm just making sure you don't walk away pretending you're the good guy. I didn't wait for his response. I grabbed my coat and my keys and left the house, leaving him standing there, finally understanding that he had made a mistake. And this was only the beginning. I knew he would run straight to her. It was predictable. He needed someone to tell him he was still in control, that I was just being emotional, that everything would blow over if he played it right. But things weren't going to blow over. I just had to make sure she realized that too. So, I made a phone call. Tessa answered on the second ring. Her voice was high, sweet, the voice of someone who thought she had won. Hello? Hi, Tessa, I said, my tone polite. I assume you know who this is? A pause. Then, her voice dropped slightly. Yeah. What do you want? Oh, just thought I'd give you a heads up since my husband isn't being completely honest with you. She scoffed, trying to sound unaffected. I know everything, actually. Do you? I let the silence stretch, just long enough for the first seeds of doubt to settle. Then I'm sure he told you that he doesn't have access to our accounts anymore, that he's been flagged for financial misconduct, that our divorce is about to get very expensive for him. Silence. I smiled. I just figured you should know, I continued, because I assume you're planning a future with him, maybe even moving in together. Would be a shame if all those big plans came crashing down because he conveniently forgot to mention that he's broke. She let out a nervous little laugh. He's not broke. Not yet. I heard her breath catch. Anyway, I won't keep you, I said lightly. Just thought you deserved the truth. Good luck. I hung up before she could say anything else. Minutes later, I got a text from him. What the hell did you say to Tessa? I ignored it. I wasn't about to start explaining myself to a man who had planned my replacement before he even told me we were done. Instead, I poured myself a drink and waited. Because I knew this was the first crack in their perfect little fantasy. And once a crack starts, it only gets bigger. The fallout didn't take long. By the next evening, he came home later than usual. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled. He looked tired, frustrated, like the weight of everything was finally pressing down on him. I stayed curled up on the couch, flipping through my phone like I hadn't noticed. He stood there for a moment, watching me, debating whether to say something. You talked to Tessa? His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it. I glanced up. Yeah. His jaw tensed. Why? She deserved to know the situation she's stepping into. I shrugged, setting my phone down. I would have appreciated the same courtesy before marrying you. He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't gotten the response he wanted from her either. I wondered if she had started to pull away, if she was beginning to realize that the fantasy he had sold her was crumbling at the edges. You're making this worse than it has to be, he muttered, walking toward the kitchen. For who? He didn't answer. He just poured himself a drink and downed it in one go. I let the silence settle, stretching between us like an invisible battlefield. He was unraveling, and he knew it. He had gone into this thinking I would roll over, sign the papers, let him walk away with everything. Instead, he was starting to understand that he had completely miscalculated. And it was only getting worse for him. By the way, I added, my tone casual, the lawyer says we have enough evidence to push for a bigger settlement. Since you were financially preparing for this divorce while pretending to still be committed to the marriage, the court might see that as deliberate deception. His head snapped toward me. That's not... He stopped himself, closing his eyes like he was trying to compose himself. That's not how it works. I tilted my head. Guess we'll find out. His phone buzzed. He grabbed it off the counter and checked the screen. His expression shifted, tension creeping in, lips pressing together. I already knew. Tessa was starting to see through him, too. He tossed the phone onto the counter and ran a hand through his hair, frustration written all over his face. I had seen this look before, back when things didn't go his way at work, when a deal fell apart, or a client pulled out. Only this time, he wasn't dealing with a business failure. He was watching his carefully built escape plan collapse around him. I stood up, stretching, letting out a small yawn. Rough day? He didn't answer. Get some rest, I said, walking past him toward the bedroom. You're going to need it. And I meant it. Because his worst days were still ahead of him. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of his raised voice. It was early, too early for him to be arguing with anyone but me. But I wasn't the target this time. I walked into the hallway, pausing just out of sight. What do you mean you need time? His voice was low, strained. Tessa. I didn't have to hear the other side of the conversation to know exactly what was happening. She was rethinking everything. The cracks had grown too wide. Maybe she had looked into his finances and realized he wasn't as stable as he pretended to be. Maybe she was starting to wonder if the same fate awaited her down the line. I left my wife for you, he snapped, his voice rising. And now you're getting cold feet? I smiled. So that was how he had framed it to her, like he had sacrificed something for their love, rather than planning his exit behind my back for months. I wondered if she was seeing it now, the pattern of selfishness, the entitlement, the way he always took without thinking about what it cost anyone else. There was a long pause. I could hear his breathing, short and uneven. Then, lower, almost desperate. No, no. We can talk about this. Just don't. Silence. The call had ended on her terms. He let out a frustrated curse, and I finally stepped into the room. Trouble in paradise? I asked, my tone light. His head snapped toward me, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with frustration. He was losing everything all at once, and for the first time, he knew it. Stay out of this, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Out of what? I walked to the coffee maker, keeping my movements slow, deliberate. Your relationship issues? I thought you wanted to handle things like adults. He exhaled harshly, leaning against the counter. I could see it now, the wear in his face, the tension in his posture. He was unraveling piece by piece. This isn't how it was supposed to go, he mumbled under his breath. I turned, coffee mug in hand, and gave him a slow, knowing smile. No, I agreed. It really isn't. And that was the moment I knew. He finally realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. For the next few days, he barely spoke to me. He moved around the house like a man trapped in his own bad decisions, each step heavier than the last. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. The frozen accounts, the legal battle, the mistress slipping through his fingers. Everything he thought was certain had started to unravel, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Then, on Friday evening, he finally broke. I was in the living room, flipping through emails from my lawyer, when he walked in and stood by the doorway, hesitating. I didn't acknowledge him at first. I let him stew in the silence, let him work up the courage to say whatever was burning inside him. Can we talk? His voice was tight, controlled, but there was something else under it. Defeat. I looked up, tilting my head slightly. About what? Everything. He exhaled sharply. Look, this is getting out of hand. I know things haven't been perfect between us, but do we really need to make this so difficult? I studied him, noting the way he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. He was testing the waters, trying to see if there was a way to manipulate the situation in his favor. You mean difficult for you? I asked. His jaw tightened. For both of us. No, I corrected. For you. You expected to walk away clean, start over with her, and keep everything you wanted. And now you're realizing that's not how this works. He didn't deny it. He just sighed and sat down on the couch across from me, rubbing a hand over his face. I made a mistake, he admitted. I raised an eyebrow. Which part? All of it. He finally met my gaze. I wasn't thinking. I got caught up in something that wasn't real. Tessa, she's not. He stopped himself, shaking his head. Ah. So she had officially dropped him. I waited, letting him continue, but he didn't. He just sat there, staring at me like he was waiting for forgiveness, for some kind of reassurance that everything would be okay. But I wasn't going to give him that. So, what do you want? I asked, crossing my legs. He swallowed. Maybe we don't have to do this. Maybe we can figure things out. I stared at him for a long moment. This man, this selfish, arrogant man who had planned his escape, drained our accounts, slept with another woman, and expected me to be the one who made things easy for him. And now that his plan had crumbled, he wanted me to be his safety net. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Let me make something very clear to you, I said, my voice calm, steady. You left me, not the other way around. You threw away this marriage because you thought there was something better waiting for you. And now that you've realized that was a lie, you think you can come back? His lips parted, but I held up a hand before he could speak. No, I said simply. You don't get a second chance. You don't get to rewrite this story. You made your choice, and now, you get to live with it. His face hardened, his pride kicking in, but I could see the flicker of panic behind his eyes. For the first time in his life, he had no way out. I stood up, smoothing my dress. "Oh, and by the way," I added as I walked past him, "my lawyer says we're pushing for a higher settlement now. Since you wasted marital assets on your affair, the court might find that interesting." He turned sharply. "You wouldn't." I smiled. "Watch me." And with that, I left him sitting there, staring at the wreckage of the life he had destroyed with his own hands. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. He fought, of course. He tried to argue that the settlement was unfair, that I was being vindictive. He even tried to claim that freezing the accounts had been a spiteful move. But the forensic accountant's report told a different story. The judge saw through him. In the end, I got the house, a significant portion of our savings, and a settlement large enough to rebuild my life the way I deserved. He was left scrambling, picking up the pieces of a future he thought was guaranteed. As for Tessa, she was long gone. She had moved on before the ink on our divorce papers was dry, realizing that the man she had fallen for wasn't the catch she thought he was. Without the security he had promised her, she had no reason to stay. One evening, a week after the final ruling, I received a text from him. "So that's it? After everything, we just pretend we never happened?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed my reply. "Me. No. I'll never pretend it didn't happen, because it taught me exactly what kind of man you are." I hit send and blocked his number. A month later, I stood in the doorway of my house now, taking in the quiet, the peace, the freedom. I had redecorated, thrown out the old furniture, stripped away every trace of him. What once felt like a home suffocating under his presence now felt like mine again. And that was the greatest revenge of all. Because he had tried to erase me from his life, to trade me in for something shinier, something new. But in the end, I was the one who walked away with everything that mattered, while he was left with nothing but regret. He thought leaving me was his fresh start, but I was the one who truly started over, and this time, I was finally free.